Welcome to the intersection of city politics and everyday life. I'm Brian Lehrer. Today, gimme shelter. It's less than 2 weeks to Election Day here in New York, when voters will almost certainly renew Mayor Bill de Blasio's lease on Gracie Mansion. De Blasio is running, or some say coasting, on his progressive record. Pre-K, the minimum wage, sick leave, low crime with far less stop and frisk. However, the mayor does not boast about one issue: homelessness. It's worse. This week, the city's Department of Homeless Services counted more than 60,000 people in the shelter system. That's up more than 7,000 during de Blasio's mayoralty. And his hopes of building 90 new shelters around the city have triggered a backlash, including from communities with very few shelters and communities that already feel overburdened. For example, on feeling overburdened, at a March town hall style meeting in Crown Heights, Firebrand Assemblywoman Diana Richardson, herself once homeless, told the group, "I like the mayor, I see him, I give him a hug, but..."
We have to do the right thing at this point because the situation is just so dire on the ground. And mind you, I'm just talking about the oversaturation of the shelters being put in our district. But when you overlap the oversaturation of the shelters that are in our district, couple that with the eviction data in our district, our district is under hard, severe times.
In what Assemblywoman Richardson called hard, severe times, could a different array of homelessness policies work better? Baruch College professor Thomas Main has some thoughts. He is the author of a new book, Homelessness in New York City, Policymaking from Koch to de Blasio. City Councilman Ritchie Torres joins us as well. As chair of the Committee on Public Housing, he knows how the political machinery works and confronts the homelessness issue as he represents the 15th District in the Central Bronx. That includes Bedford Park, Fordham, Mount Hope, Bathgate, Belmont, East Tremont, West Farms, Van Nest, Allerton, and Olinville. Did I leave anything out?
Captures most of it.
And journalist Rachel Holliday Smith is here. She reports from the Brooklyn front of the shelter wars. Her beat at DNAinfo covers Prospect Heights and Crown Heights. Welcome to all of you. And we'll get to the shelters issue and other things that de Blasio may be doing. But let's look at the big picture first. I want to put up a graph. This is the shelter population in New York City from 1983 to the present. And you see it's not a straight line up, but it's practically a straight line up, certainly going up very regularly in the last 10 years. So Thomas Main, as the historian of homelessness here, why is this happening?
The simplest explanation is you get more poor people and fewer affordable units, and the result is you have more homelessness. Right? Now, that's a bit of an oversimplification, but I think that's a lot of it, a lot of the issue. Let's see, it's been a problem for mayors since the early 80s. The shelter system really wasn't developed in the form we know it now until the Koch administration, as a result of the Callahan versus Carey consent decree. The shelter populations started expanding very rapidly. It tapered off a little bit, I think, during the Giuliani years when more requirements were imposed on to enter the shelter. And then under Bloomberg, it really took off when subsidies to move families out of the shelter system were eliminated. So that's, I think, very briefly, the why.
You mentioned a consent decree
Yes.
That the viewers may not know. This was, what, a court ruling that the city has to provide shelter to homeless people?
Yes. Basically, there are three phases of shelter policy in New York City. One was from the signing of this consent decree. It wasn't a court ruling, it was rather a consent decree, where the city and the advocates for the homeless basically agreed, yes, the city will provide shelter to homeless men originally, and then that was expanded to women and to families. Okay.
And just to stay on the
Sure.
history for a second before we bring in our
Okay.
other guests, I mean, if you look at the line on the graph, it makes it appear as if there was hardly any homelessness in New York before 1983. Is that the case?
Well, there was there were always people who were called homeless, also known as derelicts in the Bowery, for example. And
the old terminology.
Right, that was the old terminology, yes. And certainly, if you look at the newspapers, there was more and more recognition. People were seeing more homeless people on the street. Right? But it wasn't until, and there was a small shelter system for men, only for men. But it really wasn't until the signing of the Callahan versus Kerry consent decree, which I think was in '81, or it was before '83. That's when the city had to start opening up shelters very rapidly, right? And really couldn't say no to anybody, or at least not to single individuals. And so it was that point, and that's the phase that I call the entitlement phase of homeless policy, just establishing that, yes, if you're homeless, you will get some sort of shelter. And that phase lasted through the Koch administration and through most of the Dinkins administration. So,
Councilman, how would you trace the arc of, let's say, your lifetime in your district in the Central Bronx? Is it a particular issue? I know you chair the Public Housing Committee of City Council, which oversees NYCHA.
Yeah.
How about homelessness in your district? How would you characterize it? How would you characterize its march over time?
Well, I think my district's a microcosm of the trends that are unfolding citywide. I represent a district that has the highest concentration of cluster sites. And, you know, as far as the causes, I mean, there are deeper causes and then there are immediate causes. I think the deeper causes lie in the gap between wages and rent. You know, wages and incomes have been stagnating and declining in real terms, whereas rent has been spiraling out of control, less so in the Bronx than elsewhere in the city, but the rent burden has been rising dramatically in the Bronx. And then, as the professor rightly noted, there's a real gap between supply and demand. The demand for affordable housing far exceeds the supply, and when constituents come to my office in search of affordable housing, there's a limit to what I can do. Right? All of it is determined by a lottery, and you have waiting lists that have tens of thousands of people. In the case of NYCHA, over 250,000 people on the waiting list for public housing, yet you only have an annual turnover of 5,000 units.
What do you call cluster sites? What are they?
So these, instead of shelters, these are shelter units that are interspersed with residential units in an otherwise residential building. And cluster sites have come to be regarded as some of the most dangerous forms of shelter. In the Bronx, in Hunts Point, there were 2 infant children who died as a result of an explosion resulting from a radiator in a poorly maintained shelter. And so the mayor has come out with a plan aimed at phasing out the most dangerous facilities, the cluster sites and the commercial hotels, and replacing them with actual shelters run by not-for-profits with built-in services. And look, in an ideal world, there would be no homelessness and no shelters, right? But the reality is, as long as we're facing levels of homelessness we have not seen since the Great Depression, the need for shelters will persist. And so the question is not whether we will have shelters, the question is what kind of shelters. Better to have safe shelters run by professional not-for-profits with built-in services than to have unsafe shelters that come at the expense of affordable housing.
Just one quick follow-up on the cluster sites. In theory, isn't it better to have integrated housing? That is, the way you described the cluster sites, a few units for homeless people here, a few there, so you're not just ghettoizing all the homeless people together in a segregated environment like a big shelter?
I'm a proponent of integrated housing, but shelter is quite different from housing. When I think of housing, I think of something stable, permanent, and so shelter should serve as a transition to permanent housing, which should be integrated.
So the cluster sites are little shelters?
Those are shelters. I would not regard that as permanent housing. Yeah. And in fact, when, you know, if you're an owner and if you receive more in rent from the city for a shelter unit than you would from a tenant for an affordable housing unit, you as an owner, and it has been said that owners have received up to $2,000, $3,000 a month, you as an owner have a perverse incentive to take units out of the permanent affordable housing stock for the purpose of operating them as shelters. I think that does a disservice to the city.
All right, Rachel, we're going to bring you in on your Crown Heights, Prospect Heights beat, and I want you to watch this clip. It's from another town hall meeting, and we're going to watch a resident of Crown Heights, who's speaking at the meeting, comparing placement of shelters in Crown Heights to the more upscale neighborhood of Carroll Gardens.
It doesn't happen in Carroll Gardens, it happens in Crown Heights. It happens in Flatbush.
1 minute.
And we gotta stop this. We gotta stop the bullshit.
So what's happening in Crown Heights that it's such a flashpoint neighborhood?
Well, gentrification is happening in Crown Heights, and actually that clip that you just showed is Alicia Boyd, who is a noted activist in the neighborhood, I won't say anti-development, but anti-gentrification certainly, and she actually led an effort to stop a rezoning from happening there a couple of years ago, and has continued fighting, you know, the big changes in the neighborhood, and people are very cognizant of any big changes that happen in the neighborhood because, for a lot of reasons, there's new businesses, there's new condos, there's a lot going on in Crown Heights. And when this new shelter program plan was announced from Mayor de Blasio, he said the first five shelters, 3 of them would be in Prospect Heights and Crown Heights. So I think that a lot of people were angry because they heard from the mayor, we're going to be more fair about this. But then 3 of the first 5 shelters were actually in this neighborhood. I think one of them was on Bergen Street, which is on the north side of Crown Heights. Particularly there, just a couple of blocks away, is the very large Bedford Atlantic Armory men's shelter, which for anyone who lives in the Bed-Stuy, Crown Heights area, has been sort of a specter in the neighborhood for years and years and years. So as Alicia Boyd said, you know, people feel like they're being dumped on. They don't feel like this is truly fair yet. And even now, I just got the numbers from the Department of Homeless Services, and they've announced 6 shelters. They have 2 more planned, and all of them are in Brooklyn and the Bronx. I don't think there are any planned yet for Staten Island or elsewhere.
I think the mayor's argument, and tell me how people in neighborhoods that you report on would react to this. The mayor's argument is people who are homeless should have a right to stay roughly in the neighborhood in which they previously lived. And so if there's a lot of homeless people coming in Crown Heights, in Prospect Heights, in Bedford-Stuyvesant, there should be shelters there, rather than move these people to facilities that are disconnected from their families, from their communities, onto Staten Island or wherever else it might be. What's the pushback against that?
I think the most strong argument I've heard about how people understand that, they intuitively understand that, but I think people are still angry when there are communities that every community has homeless people, but many communities have not a single shelter. So I think people understand that people need to be near their churches and their families and their schools, but when certain communities truly do not have a single shelter in them, and then you see 3 shelters opening up in one area, people get pretty upset about that.
Where are you, Councilman, on the mayor's plan?
I have a wait-and-see attitude. I feel like, look, you have 2 worthy goals, right? On one hand, we do have an interest in keeping people connected to their local community, to their local networks. At the same time, we do have an interest in ensuring fair share, right? That every community is bearing its fair share of the homelessness burden. And those 2 goals do come into tension. But I do believe that what the mayor has done when it comes to fair share has been woefully inadequate, because there are communities like mine that have proportionally more shelter units than we do homeless families.
But, you know, the criticism I would lodge against the plan to build 90 more shelters is that it's too visible and too centralized. I think that, for instance, when Dinkins had a plan to build a mere 25 shelters, right? So how do you get communities to buy into this? So the Dinkins plan was, oh, it's going to be so transparent, so fair, there's going to be so much consultation, we're going to use computers and everything else, nobody will be able to dispute that the decisions were made objectively and on the merits, etc., and therefore communities will buy it. Communities didn't buy it, right? And so what was the problem? One of the problems was simply by having City Hall make the decision and centralizing it and making it very visible, it gave communities a target to shoot at. When the Dinkins administration said, you know what, we're not going to build the shelters, but we're going to have nonprofits build them, then each individual nonprofit cut an individual deal with the local community. The whole thing was much lower profile, and it happened. So I think de Blasio may have fallen into the trap of his mentor by being, trying to be too much of a good guy, or at least, let's put it this way, too visible and giving people a target to attack.
I'm a little skeptical about that argument because the siting of supportive housing developments is decentralized, but it nevertheless sets off hysterical reactions from communities. And it could be that we're just living in a different time where, people, there's just a fear of loss. People are afraid of losing their homes, are afraid of losing their jobs, afraid of losing their quality of life. And there's an association of homelessness with declining quality of life, right? That is a prejudice that's deeply ingrained in the public imagination.
A prejudice or an accurate reflection?
I think, as with every prejudice, it could have a kernel of truth. Mm-hmm. But that's what's driving the anxiety that people have. People are afraid of losing the character of their neighborhoods. The trouble with that term is that it can be racially coded. Yeah. It's a complicated phenomenon.
Well, let me ask you this. How well do you think how successful do you think the mayor is being so far with his plan that's visible and centralized? Yeah. How's that working out for him?
I mean, I agree with your criticisms. I'm not clear that, but I think whether you have a centralized approach or a decentralized approach, the underlying anxiety that communities feel will remain. Yeah. And some of the hysteria, anti-homelessness hysteria, is implacable. Yeah, so there's no magic bullet that's going to make communities feel comfortable with an infusion of new shelters.
It's just a matter of more or less.
Sure. Rachel?
I will say that the hysteria that happened in Crown Heights has died down a lot. There were 2 lawsuits actually to fight 2 of these new homeless shelters. They were lost. The homeless shelters opened, and now they're open and operating. And I personally haven't heard much of a peep about any of them. They're on residential blocks. I talked to one resident who lives half a block away from one of them, and he did say, people loiter a little bit. We're still not so happy, but by and large, the hysteria has died down on those first.
There's another shelter, I think, a women's shelter in Prospect Heights.
Yes.
That doesn't cause the same kind of pushback. Is it just because women aren't associated with crime in the same ways as men are?
Actually, that's a really good point. Not specifically in that location, but I heard a lot of people say, specifically for the ones that were controversial, say this is a men's shelter and we do not want men here. They were not afraid to say that. That was said many times in many of those meetings where people were very upset. I did a story about that Prospect Heights shelter with the women there who are women who need mental health issues, help, and that block was very welcoming. They were the opposite of what was going on in Crown Heights, which was interesting to me. But I should say that shelter was actually a substance abuse location previously, so the block had been used to that social service.
Thomas Main, historically and to the present, I think there's been a back and forth on the bigger picture, getting away from the narrow issue of shelter siting right now, of what kind of housing or what kind of services homeless people need. Yeah. Is the issue of homelessness housing, as some say, or is the issue of homelessness that people who become homeless are much more likely to have other kinds of problems, be it unemployment, drug abuse, things like that, and what's called supportive housing, I guess, that comes with social services of various kinds is really what's needed if we're ever going to solve this problem in a deeper way.
Yeah, there's been kind of a dialectical development, right? The first step was the entitlement phase to shelter, where just establishing the idea that if you're homeless, you get shelter. And so that's when you heard the slogan, housing, 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 right? And shelters were opened up very rapidly with very few services, which is the way it had to be because the city was mandated to take in everybody. And so you had these big shelters opened up with very poor services. And so what you had, the entitlement was, an entitlement to free, bad shelter, right? So then the reaction sets in towards the end of the Dinkins administration with the Cuomo Commission, Andrew Cuomo coming in and basically saying, it's not all housing. Yes, there are these disabilities and so forth, and therefore you get a new phrase, the paternalistic phrase, which says when people come into the shelter, they have a right to shelter, fine, but then they also have an obligation to do something about, and the assumption was there's something wrong with them.
To get mental health treatment, substance abuse treatment,
or simply to look for housing. Right. So that was the next phase, and that was implemented under Giuliani for the most part. And in some ways, that was very successful. The quality of the shelters improved dramatically. I mean, the smell of the shelters, I remember them from back then, was terrible. And that was turned around, right? And more services were attached. Okay. So that endured really, that regime, parentalistic regime, endured through Giuliani and into the Bloomberg years. But then that, and also that phase involved the development of supportive housing. And the idea that, hey, you know, some folks have these disabilities and they have to go to housing, which is not a shelter, but where there are all sorts of services attached. So the problem with that is not everybody would buy the deal that, hey, if you clean up your act, you'll get housing, right, or shelter, right? So under de Blasio, there was the next step was post-paternalism, where the thought was, listen, here's what we're going to do. Yes, we're going to allow people who are living on the street, we're going to just move them into shelters right away, not ask for any quid pro quo, and then later on, we'll hope when they're stable, then they'll take the services. So actually that process ended up with, I think, the post-paternalistic reign involving what's known as housing first still is in place, and I think that's an appropriate policy. The whole question is simply implementing it effectively.
Are people having this conversation in Crown Heights or Prospect Heights that you see as a reporter, or does everything resolve around the Band-Aid of shelter placement?
You mean about supportive services versus just...
and longer-term fixes.
I see. Well, I heard from many people that in one of these shelters, which was a newly built building, everyone said, why can't you just make this affordable housing? So people had that argument, and I don't know if there's I haven't heard, a good answer to that, but the city has certainly been trying to push their plan by saying we are giving people lots and lots of services. There's going to be housing placement, there's going to be job training, help, but I don't think that that's made people feel any better about these shelters.
Councilman, as chairman of the Public Housing Committee, is there an issue, because the waiting list is always so long to get into NYCHA housing, with a policy, and you tell me how much this policy is actually in effect, of letting people who become homeless bump the line and get priority for moving into NYCHA units over people who've been waiting for a long time but are not homeless?
That is correct. In fact, the advocates refer to the Bloomberg era as the lost decade, because we went 10 years without setting aside public housing units or Section 8 vouchers for the homelessness. And then we saw Mayor de Blasio reverse course. So we are setting aside more units for the homeless than we did under Bloomberg, but not as many as we could. There are 5,000 units that become available every year, and only a fraction of those go toward the homeless. So a case could be made that we should be committing all 5,000 units in the hopes of cracking down on the affordability crisis, but that raises a whole host of other questions. I think NYCHA's position is that if we have more homeless families entering the shelters, there's going to be a need for social services as well.
What's your position?
I believe that, yes, there is a subset of the shelter population whose homelessness is driven largely by chemical addiction or mental illness. But the vast majority of people in the shelters are there because they simply cannot afford market rate rent, right? It is often the case that the difference between a run-of-the-mill tenant in public housing and a run-of-the-mill shelter resident is luck, is that one had the serendipity of living in public housing and one had the misfortune of facing displacement from a market rate apartment. So I would be in favor of maximizing the number of homeless families, of public housing units available to homeless families, because the numbers are spiraling out of control. The homelessness crisis shows no real signs of abating. 60,000 is just simply unmanageable.
Thomas?
Well, I was going to say there are a number of problems with moving many more homeless families into NYCHA. For instance, one is if you make all the units that become available, if you give them to homeless people, well, what about, for example, people who are in the witness protection program, who also have a priority for housing? So it turns out there are a number of other needy groups, not as large as the homeless, but some, and they have to be factored in. That's number one. Number two, you do kind of have this issue of unfairness. You have people who are oftentimes, as you point out, waiting on the waiting list, not all that much better off than the homeless, and then they don't like it when or sometimes they're made to feel like chumps when the homeless families jump the line as they see it. So I think that the de Blasio administration, I think it was correct to reverse the Bloomberg position, which is that we weren't going to put anybody in from the shelters into NYCHA. Bloomberg did that because he thought that would encourage people to move into the shelters. That is apparently not correct. So, but however, when de Blasio was elected, he reversed the Bloomberg position, but didn't only by a few thousand families a year. He didn't do it dramatically, and I think maybe that cautious approach was the correct approach.
Here's where I look. Public housing is the deepest form of affordable housing. It's housing for those in greatest need. The families in greatest need are homeless families, right? Even when we provide families with vouchers, there are landlords who refuse to accept those vouchers. Whereas that is a problem that we don't have to worry about in the case of public housing. NYCHA would accept those vouchers. We could even provide more resources. And keep in mind that the units in NYCHA tend to be larger. You know, one of the problems that we have in public housing is that a substantial percentage of the public housing stock is under-occupied, right? And NYCHA has a huge amount of public housing land.
Meaning a few people living in big apartments.
Right. You can have a senior citizen who lives in a 5-bedroom apartment, right? Imagine if we could create senior housing on public housing land, relocate the seniors to new senior housing, and then free up larger apartments in public housing for larger families that are languishing in the shelters. You're killing two birds with one stone. So public housing can be a powerful tool for addressing homelessness.
Well, you know, here's an easy fix that you mentioned. Yeah. One of my master's degree students wrote about this. Why not kind of right-size families in NYCHA and move the person who was living in an apartment, which is very large, move her to a smaller apartment. And, you know, I think that could be done, and that would free up more units. It ruffles some feathers, though. But I think that's an easy fix that ought to be implemented.
So not so simple because, you know, there are seniors who do cling firmly to their apartments.
Yeah, that's right.
And you never want to coerce senior citizens into relocating. So I know there have been attempts to experiment with cash incentives. Yeah. But even if the tenants are willing to relocate, there is a cap on the number of units that NYCHA can right-size in a given year because turnover is so low.
And they want the grandkids to be able to sleep over.
That's true.
That's right.
And on that, we acknowledge that we're not going to solve homelessness tonight, but this was a great conversation. I think viewers learned a lot from all three of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That's great.
And that's our program for today. We're here each week, midweek, at the often hazardous intersection of politics and everyday life. Remember, Election Day is November 7th. Let's keep informing ourselves about the candidates and the issues, and tune into my radio program weekdays 10 a.m. to noon on WNYC 93.9 FM and AM 820. I'm Brian Lehrer. Thanks for watching.